The sky above Glaciara 4 was a swirl of distant stars, half obscured by the thick gray atmosphere of the planet. In orbit, the shuttle doors began to hiss and open, revealing a row of 12 cadets suited in standard-issue thermosuits. Among them stood Jonah, quiet, focused, and the only human in the lineup. He had seen the others glancing at him during the briefing, some with amusement, others with open doubt. He was shorter than the towering Drenari twins beside him, leaner than the armored Narcoon with his 4 limbs flexing in agitation. But he didn't look nervous, just still. One by one, the cadets stepped onto their designated launch pads. A blaring sound echoed across the bay, and the countdown began. Jonah's breath fogged inside his helmet as the clamps around his boots released and gravity took over. In a sudden drop, like a trap door under his feet, he fell. Glaciara 4 wasn't just cold, it was death in motion. Below him stretched a vast tundra layered in blue-tinted snow, jagged crystal formations and windstorms that cut visibility to nothing in minutes. Jonah activated his descent stabilizers and maneuvered into the right position, landing softly on the designated test field. 10 seconds later, other cadets began touching down around him, some with a stumble, others with near-perfect precision. The test had officially begun. The rules had been simple during the briefing. Survive for 48 hours. No advanced AI, no drones, no shelters. All tools would be standard and basic: knives, pots, rope, and an emergency beacon that could only be used once. The professor monitoring from orbit would not interfere unless a life was in danger. As Jonah unlatched his supply case and took stock, he noted the terrain around them. The surface was uneven, wind-scarred, and bitterly cold. Even through his thermos suit, he could feel the bite of it creeping into his spine. The others, wasting no time, activated their environmental shields and began setting up force field tents. Blue flickers of energy lit the area like fireflies. The Drenari brothers argued over orientation angles. The Diluvian girl was calibrating her hydration recycler. The Narcoon cadet thudded his mechanical feet into the snow and began assembling a hexagonal frame for shelter. Jonah watched them all for a few moments, then turned and walked away. He didn't say a word. No announcement, no dramatic exit, just a steady pace away from the group, uphill toward a rocky rise where snow had accumulated deeper than elsewhere. A few of the cadets noticed his departure. One of the Drenari muttered something about primitive instincts. The Diluvian girl scoffed and returned to adjusting her climate membrane. Jonah reached the ridge and knelt by the snow, testing its composition with gloved fingers. It was densely packed, laced with fine granules of frost, perfect for building. He removed a curved knife from his belt and began carving, not wildly or haphazardly, but with a method born of repetition: cut, lift, shape, stack. He worked in silence, ignoring the icy wind that howled past his visor. The others could keep their shimmering shields. Jonah would build something solid, something real. An hour passed. The temperature dropped, the force field tents began to flicker slightly as the planet's magnetic interference worsened. Jonah's shelter, however, was beginning to take form, a half-sphere carved entirely from the snow itself. Each block was angled, each joint sealed with powder packed and smoothed. It was a structure older than history, taught to Arctic survivors on Earth, passed down by people who thrived in conditions even worse than this. Inside the observation room aboard the ship in orbit, Professor Alvex monitored the biometric feeds. He raised an eyebrow at the human's vitals. Steady, slightly lower than average, but not in distress. Odd. He tapped the console and pulled up the external cam feed from Jonah's suit. Snow blocks, manual labor, primitive shelter design. Alvex frowned. "He's building a dome?" he said out loud. His assistant, a Yeren with translucent skin, blinked slowly. "A rudimentary snow dome," Alvex confirmed. "He's not even using the heater module." Back on the surface, the first signs of trouble were emerging among the others. One of the Drenari brothers shouted in frustration as his field tent collapsed, the generator having failed to charge. The Narcoon had managed to keep his shelter intact, but the external shell was frosting from the inside, causing visibility problems and moisture buildup. The Diluvian girl's hydration system had jammed from frozen condensation, and she was now trying to manually clear the intake with a micro tool. Jonah had lit a candle inside his igloo. It was a simple chemical flame, barely a flicker, but enough to melt a bowl of snow into water. He drank slowly, sipping the warmth. The walls around him glowed faintly from the reflection of the flame, creating a gentle golden halo inside the dome. Outside, the wind screamed, but inside, there was silence. He lay back on a carved bench, arms crossed behind his head. He had reinforced the inner ceiling with a central keystone, angled to prevent collapse. A ventilation hole let out smoke and heat just enough to avoid condensation. His body heat, combined with the candle, was raising the internal temperature by a few degrees each hour. By midnight, he would be warm. He didn't gloat, he didn't check the feeds or call anyone for comparison. He simply rested. In the darkness outside, another cadet's scream cut through the wind. One of the shield tents had collapsed entirely, and the alien inside had triggered the emergency beacon. Within minutes, the system dispatched a drone to extract her. The test would continue, but she had failed. Jonah heard none of it, or if he did, he made no reaction. His world now was the small dome of snow around him, the flickering candlelight, and the soft, insulated silence of being prepared. By morning, he would learn just how unprepared the others were, but for now, he slept, warm, dry, and alive. The first light of the Glaciara 4 morning was not truly light at all. A pale, ghostly shimmer spread across the horizon, barely penetrating the thick snow clouds swirling overhead. Wind gusts continued to lash the ice fields, their howl constant and their temperature murderous. Yet inside the insulated dome, Jonah stirred with quiet precision, already awake and moving before his alarm sounded. He had always been an early riser, even before the academy. Years of disciplined mornings had trained his body to respond to cold not with panic, but with purpose. He lit the second candle and placed it in a shallow recess near the back of the igloo. A faint glow spread around the curved interior walls, now slightly glossed with moisture. He checked the temperature sensor on his wrist module. Still sub-zero, but far less hostile than the outside. He smiled. The microclimate inside the structure was stable. He bent over a shallow pit he had carved in the floor the night before and added fresh snow to the tin pot resting there. It would take another half-hour to melt, but he had time. The first 24 hours were crucial. Not just for survival, but for observing what others did wrong. Jonah dressed slowly. Though still wearing the standard thermosuit, he had taken the liberty to reduce its power level overnight to conserve energy. Now he ramped it back up briefly to reheat the inner layers, then powered it back down again. Efficient usage extended battery life by days. Most cadets would not think that far ahead. Most cadets thought only about surviving the storm. Jonah thought about outlasting it. After finishing his hydration and checking the integrity of the igloo's structure, he slid open a block near the entrance that served as a door. Snow had piled up, as expected, but not enough to trap him. He pushed through and stood up into the howling white. The cold slapped him across the faceplate, but he didn't flinch. He adjusted his gait and began walking back toward the drop site. His boots crunched against hardened snow crusts as he crossed small hills and frozen drifts, until, at last, the silhouettes of the other shelters came into view. The first thing he noticed was how few of them remained standing. One of the Drenari twins, Torek, was outside, furiously beating snow off a collapsed tent with a metal rod. His skin, naturally resistant to cold, had turned an unnatural shade of grayish-purple. His brother, Dorek, crouched nearby, trying to restart the power core of their environmental shield. The spherical dome they had constructed yesterday was now nothing but a half-frozen wreck, battered down by wind and partially buried. Further ahead, the Diluvian girl, Lysa, was curled up against a frozen boulder, her climate suit sparking at the neck joint. She was mumbling to herself, fingers trembling as she worked with a diagnostic pad. A cracked thermal panel lay beside her. She didn't see Jonah approach. He stopped at a distance, watching for a moment, and then turned his gaze toward the far end of the field. The Narcoon cadet, Drex, had dug a shallow trench and covered it with a tarp made from the remnants of his broken equipment. It looked like an animal burrow, tight, low, but partially functional. Jonah admired the effort, even if the execution lacked finesse. A scream sliced through the wind. Jonah pivoted immediately. It came from the ridge just beyond the supply crates. He sprinted in that direction, snow whipping around him like claws. At the top of the rise, he spotted the source. One of the Tharnan cadets, a female with bioluminescent skin that had dimmed to a nearly colorless hue. Her shelter had collapsed completely, and her legs were caught beneath a sheet of ice that had cracked and fallen from a nearby overhang. Jonah reached her within seconds and dropped to his knees. She was conscious but disoriented, her eyes flickering with fear. He didn't speak. Words wasted breath. He pulled out his compact axe and began hacking at the ice around her legs. The impact sent shockwaves through his arms, but he didn't stop. He worked quickly, methodically, until at last the chunk broke free and she gasped in relief. He lifted her gently, slung her arm over his shoulder, and helped her stand. She was shivering violently now, her internal suit systems completely offline. There was no shelter nearby, no time to fix her gear, no functioning tents in sight. Jonah had one choice. He took her with him. The walk back was brutal. The wind resisted every step. She collapsed twice, and each time he dragged her up again. He used his own body to shield her from the worst of the gusts. It took nearly 20 minutes to reach the ridge where his igloo stood, half concealed now under fresh snowfall. He guided her through the entrance, into the warmth inside, and laid her down on the bench. Her breathing was erratic, shallow. He removed her helmet carefully and checked her vitals. Not good, but not irreversible. Hypothermia hadn't reached critical yet. Jonah added more snow to the pot, lit the third candle, and wrapped her in an emergency thermal blanket. She didn't speak, just stared at him with wide eyes as the color slowly returned to her cheeks. He sat beside her, checking her temperature every few minutes. Silence settled around them, broken only by the sound of dripping water and the occasional crack of ice outside the dome. Half an hour later, she fell asleep. Not from exhaustion alone, but from safety. Her vitals were stabilizing. Jonah didn't rest. He reinforced the entrance, packed more snow along the outer shell, and checked his battery levels again. He would need to stretch them further now that he wasn't alone. But he had accounted for that. Always plan for contingencies. Outside, another shelter collapsed, unnoticed. The wind howled louder that night. Jonah didn't hear it. Inside the dome, the air remained still. He boiled a small measure of plant protein and split it evenly between two containers. When the Tharnan girl woke again, he handed her the food without a word. She accepted it silently, her bioluminescence now returning in gentle pulses. She had no idea what to say. Jonah didn't need her to say anything. The storm had not ended, the cold was not relenting, but inside the igloo there was warmth, light, and survival. And now there were two. By mid-morning, the storm outside had grown violent enough to erase all signs of movement in the snow. The wind moved like a sentient thing, shifting and piling the drifts with aggressive, deliberate force. Loose components from failed shelters were swallowed into the white, disappearing under freshly formed dunes. From within the igloo, the world outside had ceased to exist. Only the occasional rumble of wind or the crack of distant ice formations gave any hint of what raged beyond the dome's curved walls. Jonah crouched at the entrance, chipping a narrow breathing slit above the doorway to let stale air escape. He worked without rush, conserving his energy, his movements calm and practiced. Behind him, the Tharnan girl stirred beneath her blanket, her body warmer now, though still stiff from the cold. She sat up slowly, blinking into the amber light of the candles, and watched him for several minutes in silence before speaking. "Why didn't you just call for evacuation?" Jonah didn't turn to look at her. He finished clearing the vent before replying. "I didn't need to," he said, then glanced over his shoulder. "And neither did you." She lowered her eyes. Her luminescent skin pulsed with a faint pattern of embarrassment. She wasn't used to failure. Most cadets from the Tharnan cluster weren't. Their education focused on theoretical excellence, predictive models, and the assumption that technology would always be there. Jonah hadn't said it to shame her, but the truth still weighed on her heavily. Jonah stood and gestured toward the pot of now warm water. She accepted it and drank slowly, eyes still fixed on him. He had a quiet presence, one that didn't demand attention but held it nonetheless. He didn't posture, didn't instruct. He did, and in doing, taught more than any words could convey. Minutes passed in quiet. Then came the knock. It was faint, a soft, desperate scratching against the snow-packed door block. Jonah immediately moved to clear it. When he opened the narrow entrance, the cold roared in, along with a body that fell halfway through the threshold before catching himself. It was Doric, the smaller of the Drenari twins. His face flushed with cold, his suit glitched and sparking at the joints. Jonah grabbed his arm and pulled him in without a word. The Tharnan girl immediately shifted aside, making room on the bench. Doric collapsed into the space she'd made and leaned forward, clutching his own chest as he tried to breathe steadily. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips tinged blue. "Where's your brother?" Jonah asked. Doric shook his head slowly. "Torek stayed behind. He was trying to restart the shield. I told him it was useless, but he wouldn't leave." Jonah nodded and handed him a blanket. "You'll need to share rations. We're limited." Doric nodded, too numb to argue. The warmth was already seeping into his limbs. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. "I saw the light," he whispered, "through the storm. That's how I knew where to go." Jonah glanced at the candles. Their glow, though faint, had reflected against the snow outside through the ventilation slit. A beacon not meant to call, but it had worked all the same. Less than an hour later, another knock came. Then another. By afternoon, the small dome had become a haven. 3 more cadets arrived. Lysa, whose suit had completely shut down, Drex, with snow crusted into his fur-lined armor, and Torek, dragging a scorched power core behind him. One by one they came, faces stiff and eyes wild, driven not by pride or strategy but raw survival instinct. Jonah expanded the entrance tunnel and began digging an annex to the Igloo, a branching space to the right of the main dome shaped in a half circle and packed tightly for insulation. It would take time, but it was necessary. The core structure could no longer house everyone comfortably. With 7 cadets inside, even the warmth posed a danger. Humidity could weaken the ceiling. Breath alone could cause a buildup of frost in dangerous patterns. The Tharnan girl helped first, following Jonah's motions exactly, mimicking the angle of his cuts and the pressure of his hands. Doric joined next, guided not by knowledge but by the simple need to do something. The others watched in silence, huddled and weak, their usual superiority stripped away by the elements. As Jonah worked, he listened. Torek mumbled about how he'd tried to restart the emitter with an improvised thermal boost. Drex mentioned that the trench he'd dug had caved in during the night and nearly crushed his leg. Lysa admitted that she'd screamed at her own reflection in her cracked visor, convinced it was someone else in the dark. Panic had set in across all of them. Jonah said nothing, he just kept building. By the time the annex was complete, the storm had reached its peak. The entrance was buried in over a meter of snow, but Jonah had anticipated that. A narrow tunnel sloped upward from the main floor, ending in a small hatch he'd reinforced with a snow brick lock. It could be cleared if needed, but for now they were safe inside. The temperature in the dome hovered just above freezing, enough to prevent frostbite, not enough to cause meltdown. They gathered in the main room that evening, 7 cadets wrapped in silence and disbelief. The candles burned low, casting flickers of gold on the white walls. Jonah passed around the last of the warm protein stew, dividing it into equal portions. No one spoke until Lysa broke the silence. "We were wrong about him." No one answered. "He didn't just survive. He prepared. He saved us." Torek rubbed his hands slowly over the heat pack Jonah had given him. "He's a primitive, remember?" he muttered bitterly. "That's what we said. Stubborn death worlder with outdated instincts." Doric looked across the room. "Maybe instinct is exactly what we were missing." Jonah remained quiet, seated near the vent, his eyes half closed. He didn't respond to the conversation. He hadn't done any of this for recognition. It was survival, simple, direct, and it had worked. The storm continued outside, a monster with no mind or mercy, but inside the igloo for the first time since landing, no one was cold, no one was alone, no one was afraid. Jonah leaned his head back against the wall, listening not to the wind, but to the silence that had grown between the others, a silence born of understanding, of awe, of something approaching respect. The test wasn't over, but something else had begun. The igloo had gone quiet again. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, the tension had settled into a strange and almost sacred stillness. No one moved unnecessarily. Every action was measured, every breath controlled. In the glow of the flickering candlelight, the atmosphere was not only warmer in temperature, but also heavier with unspoken recognition. Each cadet had reached this place through failure, yet each now sat in the presence of the one who had succeeded. There was no shame, but there was a shift in perspective. Jonah didn't bask in it, he never had. He sat at the edge of the main chamber, carving into a slab of snow with the tip of his knife. Not aimlessly, he was drawing. The grooves cut into the block formed lines, intersections, and curves. Doric leaned forward, his curiosity finally overcoming his exhaustion. "What are you doing?" Jonah didn't look up. "Mapping airflow," he replied quietly. This dome has a breathing rhythm. The way the wind hits it from the outside, how the warm air rises, how the cold air settles. If we don't understand it, we'll trap too much moisture and collapse the roof. Drex crawled closer, peering over Jonah's shoulder. You can feel all that from inside? Jonah nodded. You can smell the change in air, feel the tension in the walls. Snow tells you when it's stressed. Lisa raised her head from the annex opening. That's not something we're taught. You're not taught it, Jonah said softly, but you can learn it. He placed the knife down and reached for a flat snow panel he had carved earlier. In the soft light he began sketching with a shard of charcoal, an old tool salvaged from a standard emergency fire-starting kit. The diagram that emerged resembled a flow map, with channels and arrows indicating how warm breath traveled from mouth to ceiling, how ventilation holes could be placed for optimal moisture escape, and where to reinforce angles with load-bearing blocks. This isn't survival by luck, he said, it's structure, calculation, adaptation. Torek folded his arms. Why would you even know this? Earth doesn't have death blizzards like Glaciara 4. Jonah met his eyes with the same level tone. Earth has worse, places where temperature kills in seconds, where you dig or die, and people who survived those places long before tech ever existed. The Tharnan girl, now fully alert and visibly stronger, leaned forward. You mean the Arctic regions? Yes, Jonah said. The Inuit, the Sami, the Nenets. Humans who didn't just survive the cold, they lived in it, raised families in it, hunted and traveled in conditions like this, with nothing but what they could carry and what they could carve. Dork frowned. And all that from a pile of snow? Jonah nodded. Snow insulates, it absorbs sound, it traps heat if shaped right, it supports its own weight. Nature gives you what you need if you respect its rules. He stood, walked to the side wall of the igloo and pressed his palm against it. Like this wall. It curves inward near the top, not straight. That shape redistributes weight down and outward, so the snow compresses instead of collapsing. If I had cut it square like most of you built your shelters, it would have caved in the first night. Silence followed, not the silence of indifference, but of shifting understanding. No one spoke for a while. The only sound was the faint hiss of wind at the top vent and the crackle of a candle burning near its base. Drex, ever the most physically imposing of the cadets, looked down at his own clawed hands. You think strength is in the design, not the materials. Jonah gave a rare smile. Strength is knowing what fails, not just what holds. A wall isn't strong because it's thick. It's strong because it knows how to fall without breaking. Lysa sat back and stared up at the dome's ceiling. We've been taught to think of technology as the solution to every challenge. You treat it like a backup. Jonah nodded. Tech is only as good as your understanding of what it replaces. If you don't know how to make fire with sticks, a lighter is a crutch. If you don't know how to survive without heaters, you die when your suit fails. The Tharnan girl tilted her head. Why didn't you say any of this before? Back at the academy, no one asked, he said simply. The annex had become too crowded for sleep rotations. Jonah proposed splitting the group into watch shifts. Every 2 hours, someone would monitor humidity, check for wall seepage, and maintain the ventilation slit. No one objected. For the first time, the chain of command had shifted without declaration. He hadn't been assigned leadership. He hadn't taken it. But now, every decision passed through him. As the hours ticked by, he began sharing more. How to shape blocks with minimal heat loss, how to create reflective snow surfaces to bounce candlelight further, even how to determine the strength of a wind gust by the frequency of snow particles brushing against the walls. It wasn't a formal lesson, but it became one. The cadets began taking notes on rations, angles, snow texture, breathing patterns. Torek, skeptical only a few hours before, was now carving reinforcement blocks under Jonah's direction. Doric reinforced the tunnel with an arched ceiling to prevent collapse. Liza managed to melt enough clean water for the next 12 hours using a reflective tray and a single flame. A method Jonah showed her with a mirror fragment and a tin bowl. The Tharnan girl, whose name the others now whispered as Naida, took it upon herself to document the entire process in her suit's log, intending to submit it not as survival data but as curriculum material for the Academy archives. Jonah observed them all with quiet satisfaction. Not pride, he had long discarded that, but there was a subtle joy in seeing survival evolve into learning. These cadets had entered the storm as elites of theory, champions of the simulation chamber, but here, in the unforgiving belly of Glaciara 4, they were students again. And he had become something else. Not a hero, not a commander, a teacher. The storm still howled, the snow still fell, and the planet cared nothing for their transformation. But the dome had changed. It was no longer a shelter built for one. It was a classroom forged in ice. The storm broke in the early hours of the second morning, not with drama or spectacle, but with a gradual, almost reluctant retreat. The wind softened into whimpers that brushed over the igloo's curved dome and slid away into the snowfields beyond. Light returned as a pale haze, diffused and almost unreal. No one inside the dome spoke at first. The silence felt sacred, as if any sound might summon the storm back again. Jonah was the first to move. He unsealed the tunnel exit with steady hands, careful not to crack the ventilation shaft he had reinforced just hours earlier. As he crawled through and stepped outside, the cold met him like an old adversary, biting but no longer cruel. The sky overhead was clearer now, revealing glimpses of soft light reflecting off crystalline snowbanks that stretched endlessly in all directions. He stood still, scanning the field. The makeshift shelters were gone, buried or flattened. Scattered debris from broken gear lay half swallowed by drifts. What remained of the cadets' individual structures was now unrecognizable. The field looked deserted, save for the faint, chimney-like wisp of vapor curling up from the igloo's vent behind him. Jonah activated his wrist transmitter and sent the standard beacon signal to the orbital monitors. The test window had closed. Rescue would arrive shortly. When he ducked back into the shelter, the others were waiting, fully suited and ready. Lysa was double-checking the heat-sealed pouches with water rations. Naida sat cross-legged going over the handwritten note she had transcribed to her datapad. Torek and Doric were packing the tools Jonah had lent them, arranging everything neatly in 2 piles, items borrowed and items gifted. Drex gave a low nod as Jonah entered. "It's over?" Jonah returned the nod. "Rescue crew will be here within the hour." No one cheered, no one clapped or shouted in relief. The moment didn't call for it. Instead, they sat together for a few final minutes, surrounded by the snow walls that had protected them, taught them, and changed them. The walls didn't echo, they absorbed sound gently, like they had absorbed fear. Jonah watched them each in turn. He didn't say anything poetic. He didn't need to. The rescue craft arrived exactly 47 minutes later. Its landing thrusters melted a hole into the hard-packed snow, causing a small storm of ice crystals to swirl across the slope. The hatch opened and the survey team stepped out, clad in reinforced polar suits, armed with scanners and medical equipment. Professor Alvex was the last to descend. His eyes immediately swept the field, then narrowed on the lone structure still standing. Jonah met him halfway. The professor's voice was distorted slightly behind the reflective faceplate. "Where are the others?" Jonah gestured behind him. "Inside, alive. Stable." Alvex's gaze shifted toward the dome again. "The others failed. You should have passed alone. But now you've shared your knowledge, helped them survive. That's interference." Jonah didn't flinch. "That's leadership." The professor tilted his head. "That wasn't part of the assignment." Jonah looked back toward the igloo. Neither was losing half the class. Alvex said nothing at first. He walked past Jonah, stepped into the entrance tunnel, and emerged moments later, followed by his assistant who was already taking scans of the structure. The others filed out into the light, blinking, squinting, adjusting to the brightness. None looked broken, none looked defeated. They stood taller than before. The professor studied their faces. "All of you made it through the full window?" Torek nodded. "We did." Lisa took a step forward. "Because of him," Drax added. "Because of what he taught us." The professor remained silent for several long seconds. Then, without another word, he turned and tapped his console, the assessment logs uploaded to the ship's servers in a blink of blue light. The cadets were transported in 2 rotations. Jonah waited for the second one, not because he was told to, but because he wanted to see the dome one last time. When the final lift was ready, he took a long look at the structure, now bathed in soft morning light. The surface sparkled faintly. The wind, finally calm, no longer tried to tear it down. He placed his hand gently against the wall, then stepped back and boarded the ship. By the time they reached the orbital cruiser, the data had already been compiled. Professor Alvex stood in the central chamber, facing the large tactical screen filled with performance metrics, stress graphs, and biometric readings, but the most notable entry was a single file tagged manually by NIDA, titled Practical Survival Curriculum Addendum, Deathworlder Arctic Principles. Alvex opened the report, scanned its contents, and then looked at Jonah. "You rewrote what this exercise means," he said, not with disappointment but with reluctant approval. "Survival wasn't supposed to be shared." Jonah met his gaze evenly. "Then it was a flawed test." The professor closed the report. "You all pass," he said. The cadets didn't react with joy. No one celebrated, but a weight lifted from each face, subtle and unmistakable. There was dignity in what they had done, not just because they survived, but because they had done it together, learning from someone no one had expected to lead. Later that cycle, an amendment was issued to the Academy's planetary survival training curriculum. A new module appeared in the database under Earth methodologies, specifically sourced from indigenous Arctic knowledge and manual shelter building. The file name bore no author at first, but in the metadata, a signature remained. Jonah Reeve, Cadet, Earth. In time, his name would be studied as part of a case file in leadership training. His techniques would be copied, tested, and refined. But in the minds of those who had crouched inside that dome while the storm clawed at the walls, his lessons had already taken root far deeper than any classroom ever could. He had not planned to be a mentor. He had simply intended to survive. But in surviving, he had taught a new way to endure. And that was more than the exam had ever asked.